I hope this isn't too eccentric for a book talk, but I'm actually going to talk a lot about things that aren't in the book as a way to get to and introduce things that are in the book. Anybody recognize this guy by any chance?
That's not fair of me, for other people. There are other people in this room who know him.
Someone who's not best known as an actor.
Robert Daly.
Robert Daly, who told me this story. One of the first years that I was back in the United States, after my 3 years in China, I actually I got some initially adjunct teaching positions, but then 2 summers in a row, I was able to get myself back to China teaching American high school students at what was it, Hopkins Center for Talented Youth program that they were trying to expand into China. They only did it 2 years. Robert was still at the center, though. We used the Hopkins-Nanjing facilities, and he told me this story. I forget how it came up. But he acted in this movie, Beijingers Beijingers in New York. And he plays a really nasty garment boss in New York City who exploits his workers. Some people were critical of the, I guess it wasn't exactly a movie, it was a long-running TV series.
It was the most popular television series in China for a long time.
And there was a lot of debate. Some people were critical of the way it demonized the American. But the funny thing about it was actually the role was written for a Chinese actor to play a Chinese-American exploitive garment center boss, but the guy had a visa problem, and the director got his friend Robert to act it. But the reason I have this up here is that as I understand it, there are really four main channels of the relationship between the United States and China. And one of them not so well understood that I've written about. But we all know about formal diplomacy, government-to-government relationships, including the military aspects of that. We're all certainly aware of. It's hard to read at least a national daily newspaper like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, without finding articles about the economic dimensions of the relationship, whether it's American Treasury bonds, whether it's investment in China, investment in the United States, the International Monetary Fund, and popular culture, which we see here, but see embodied in so many ways. A friend of mine sent me a link the other day to an article in the New York Times. I hadn't realized that at the Panjiayuan, the dirt market of Beijing, that at closing time every day is a tradition. Apparently they play a song by Kenny G. And nobody knows why, except they've always done it that way. And, so there's American pop culture in China. There's Chinese pop culture in America. Terry and I are moving. We had a couple of movers. We're unloading, big strong guys unloading stuff out of the U-Haul truck I had driven to Chattanooga, Tennessee. And so one guy had 2 characters tattooed on either side of his neck. And he said, well, I said, you know what that means? He says, well, one of them's power and one's respect. Well, I said, well, that one's power for sure. He said, oh, I thought it was the other one. I said, I don't know the one for respect, but I guess that's the other one. Robert is interesting because he was has been involved in the popular culture channel. He was involved in formal diplomacy, like our own Jan Barris. He started early in his career. He was in the Foreign Service. And he's been in this 4th dimension. So there we got formal diplomacy. Now the economic relations, I've been involved in, as Jan says. I had this business career before, and that involved, a company I worked for sent me to China to set up a factory, but I'd been involved for some years before that as well. So Robert kind of missed that, except I imagine he's done some consulting here and there. Popular culture, and then the informal diplomacy, as some people call it, of cultural and educational exchange. The reason I've made that, does that look a little fainter than yeah. I've done that to indicate that it's, I think in my introduction to the book, I said I want to bring these things out of the shadows. So scholars know about this dimension of the relationship. Probably all of you do. Some of you, in fact, are have been involved in it. But the general public may not be quite as aware of that dimension of the relationship. Again, I said I'm going to talk about some things that aren't in the book, and in this case, I know why. It was too late that I found out about it. In some other case, I'm not sure why. But the guy on the right is Xi Jinping, is the father of the current president of China, Xi Jinping, and what this photo indicates is that it points to the significance of these exchanges. And here he is in 1980.
No, 1991.
You know, what was it? They got it wrong then.
80. 80? Was it 80?
It is 80. Okay. Well, that's what's on the Wall Street Journal
Oh,
site.
okay, I'm sorry. I should know since I trifled with it and took that picture. But I guess it's 80. 81.
We'll have to edit the podcast. So there's Xi Senior, and there's the governor of my home state of Iowa. But also the son, Xi Jinping, not sponsored by the National Committee, sponsored by a sister in Iowa, Sister City organization, came to Iowa, in particular Muscatine, kind of the southeastern part of the state, and met all classes of people, farmers, the business people, the politicians, and just months before he was chosen to be China's next current leader, he returned to Muscatine. Of course, had a great friendly welcome. So I think these images indicate the potential significance of these kinds of exchanges that often involve people who aren't in government, or even when they do involve people who are in government, are often orchestrated outside of official channels, as these exchanges work. And of course, this highlights the critical role that the National Committee on U.S. China Relations has played since the organization was founded in the late 1960s, 66, 67, I think, to educate the American public about China at a time when the two countries barely spoke to each other because of President Nixon's diplomacy and the ping pong matches that we're all familiar with. But does everyone know that who organized on the U.S. side the visit by the Chinese ping pong?
Dr. Kissinger.
But from an administrative standpoint, the National Committee stepped in to play a role and built on that and organized all manner of exchanges, from other cultural exchanges like acrobatic troops to eventually more substantive exchanges about policies, and later on started bringing young professionals and students to both to the United States and Americans to China. And chapter 2 of the book gives a whole history of that. I should say something about the book. The way it's organized, I had these 3 case studies: National Committee on U.S. China Relations. I'll say a little more about the other 2, the Hopkins-Nanjing Center for Chinese and American Studies and the 1990 Institute, and I had to find a way to pull this together. So I looked at the way a lot of other books that had multiple case studies were organized, and as it happened, I think the one I followed was Barrington Moore's Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, which had actually about half a dozen case studies and then a few chapters at the end that tried to generalize some conclusions. So the National Committee is one of these organizations. This is a picture that captures I think in many ways the essence, at least at the outset, of another Hopkins-Nanjing Center for Chinese American Studies. A man named Rundong Lai, who is currently a Chinese professor at this institution on a corner of Nanjing University that's jointly operated by the Nanjing University and Johns Hopkins University, told me about this book during one of my summer trips back, and by the time he told me about it, I think what happened was it was too late to get it into my book. But anyway, so you get a benefit by coming here that other readers of the book don't get. But it's a great picture. On the left, so Kwang Yan-ming on the right, a guy who was really knocked down hard during the Cultural Revolution, but made a comeback after 1978, after Deng Xiaoping was in power, the reforms came, wanted to do some international educational exchange. Stephen Muller, one of the real heroes of the book, was there. How many of you have know anything about this organization, Hopkins-Nanjing Center? A few, yeah, a lot of you, maybe a majority. Okay. Again, there's a chapter 1. It's detailed history. It's provided everything from opportunities for students to improve their language skills, to the cross-cultural experience of having a roommate from another country, to studying with professors from another culture. But basically, in the initial program with a certificate earned over a period of a couple of years, American students would study in Chinese with Chinese professors, all from Nanjing University. Chinese students would study with American professors from universities all over the United States, and they would room together. Now, over time, the American body became international. Let some non-American students who had native English skills come into the program, and similarly, professors came from other countries as well. One of Muller's conditions was that the university, that the center, have an open stack, uncensored library. And at one point, when they were doing the negotiations for this center, one of the Chinese asked, well, what kind of books will you have in that library? We'd like to review them. And Dr. Muller said, well, if you want to do that, then the deal's off. And even after Tiananmen Square, when political education was becoming mandatory again on Chinese campuses, the library maintained its autonomy, and so that's been a real milestone in the bilateral relationship. And students, Chinese students from outside this organization, are able to use the library as well. The third organization, chapter 3, in the book, the 1990 Institute, was founded mainly by Chinese Americans, mostly older Chinese Americans who had arrived in the 1940s and had come to study in the United States and had stayed. Over the last decade, there's been a generational transition. The man on the right also, little shout out to a friend who passed away last November, C.B. Sung. How many of you, anybody here who knows C.B.? Yeah, you mentioned Charles, you know. For a brief time, he was an employer of a former president of this organization, John Holden, and CB gave me kind of an introduction to John when I started my research on the National Committee. But wonderful man, like Jan, would read what I, drafts of what I was writing, call me. He especially liked to call me, and then I had to reach for a pen and start writing. Took me to lunch and dinner and a couple times in China to give me updates and more information, more written materials that I couldn't find on my own. Also, a businessman, but who had a long-running, interest in U.S. China relations and was a co-founder along with a man named Hang Chung, who was vice president of the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. And they founded this organization that initially conducted research on economic reforms in China and partnered both with individuals and with research institutes to try to help smooth out the economic reform process. The organization was founded in the year of its name as a response, as kind of a low-key response to the tragedy of Tiananmen Square in 1989, on the theory that if China would develop more economically, that would smooth out some of the social tensions. In recent years, as China's developed this economic capacity, and Jan and I were just discussing this in the podcast, the organization has shifted more toward direct social action projects like promoting education for young rural girls, microfinance projects. The thing that this organization highlights that is an important part of the relationship is the role that Chinese Americans have often, though not always, played in the relationship. They definitely have in this organization. As I said, the core founding group were Chinese Americans, and today 2/3 at least of the leaders, the members, the funders are Chinese Americans, although they've drawn in significant non-Chinese American support as well. Anybody familiar with the name Luce, L-U-C-E? Yeah, one of the first members was a guy named James Luce, a California attorney whose uncle founded Time Magazine, Fortune Magazine, Life Magazine, and his Uncle Henry. His father was born in China to missionary parents. Another one of the early non-Chinese American leaders, a guy named Charles McLean, who's written on the legal challenges historically by Chinese Americans to immigration restriction. But the 1990s Institute isn't the only organization that I studied or that exists in which Chinese Americans have played an important role. There's an organization called the Committee of 100.
And that's CP, Sohn was one of our early.
Okay, so you're involved with the Committee of 100, right. CB was very involved with the Committee of 100 as well, an organization of elite Chinese Americans. The Hopkins-Nanjing Center, there was a physicist at Hopkins who played a pivotal role in smoothing out communications between the two sides. Again, you read about that in the book. So I think I'll try to wrap up and leave this open for some questions. But the last three chapters kind of try and synthesize what these non-governmental relations have meant, how they've affected China, how they've affected the relationship between the two countries. The conclusion that I guess I've talked about all along is that these non-governmental exchanges play an important role. I mentioned that Chinese Americans have played an important role. Another important conclusion is the significance of this concept of civil society. Civil society being, for if you're not social theory people, organized society that's not part of the state and not part of the family. There's some dispute over whether the organized business, the marketplace, and the businesses and labor unions that inhabit it are part of civil society. To me, they are, and in fact, that their economic independence from the state makes it possible for the organizations that they fund to be independent of the state. And this relationship has helped promote a process that's already underway in China of the flowering of something that looks like and acts like a civil society. Although there's ongoing scholarly discussion about whether it's proper to use this term civil society to refer to organizations in China which are not fully independent of the state. They're either heavily, in many cases, heavily funded by the states, heavily regulated by the states. But my conclusion is that I believe it does make sense to use this term, and that however attenuated the civil society in China might be, it is evolving, and it is one of the sources of better life for people in China. Back to the title of the book, I guess, or what's now the subtitle, Invited Influence. I'll give an example of this. It's not just that the Chinese government and Chinese non-governmental organizations and intermediate quasi-governmental organizations like universities, such as Nanjing University, have invited and encouraged and wanted American partners and American ideas. It's that the Chinese side of that relationship has wanted to and been able to exert a significant influence over the agenda of these exchanges. I'll give just one example, then I'll stop. One of the economic reform studies that the 1990 Institute sponsored was on fiscal policy by an economist named Roy Ball, B-A-H-L. And when I interviewed Professor Ball, I asked him how that worked, and he said, well, he was actually describing some earlier research he had done funded by the Ford Foundation. And he said, well, they would call me up, they'd say, Professor Ball, we need you in Suzhou next week, show up, everything will be taken care of. And then I'd come and they'd ask me questions. It was like I was a plumber, and they just, they told me what they wanted done. So I'll stop there and entertain questions. How do we do this?
That's fine. We will.
Maybe I'll sit now.
Yes, please. When you ask a question, please let us know who you are and what organization you're with, and open for questions.
So you
Charles,
talk
introduce
about,
yourself.
yeah, Charles Wong here from Committee 100.
And also several other organizations along the way. Very helpful in this
I
sector.
was under the impression that you're going to talk a little bit more about the NGOs of China. But anyway, so I think here we see the NGOs as a major component, partners with the government in delivering services or help to shape policies. So how do you see the interaction between national committee and the Chinese government in terms of the policy aspect? Are there rooms for that kind of interaction in China?
Between the National Committee and
As
the
an
Chinese-
NGO, yeah, with Chinese government.
Okay.
thought you were going to ask the question differently. What is the interaction between the Chinese NGOs and their government?
But that
You can answer
wasn't
both.
your talk, but I heard.
Yeah, well, there's a little bit, there's some discussion of Chinese NGOs in the book. Yeah, the National Committee and other American organizations who have wanted to have non-governmental partners have needed the assent of some level of government in China. It's it's difficult to link up with oppositional groups in China. That's worked particularly well in the case of organizations involved in promoting, environmental improvement, environmentalism. That's because the government in Beijing is very much in favor of reducing air pollution, water pollution, preserving wetlands, and things like that. So when the when the National Committee, for example, had a couple of different long-term environmental projects, there wasn't an obstacle to seeking out local partners. But if someone's concerned about labor education, or re-education prisons or something like that, they're going to run into a problem. Or someone wants to link up with the Falun Gong, they might have a problem with the government of Beijing. Someone at the back.
Hi, my name is Corinne Chang. I'm from U.S. China Academy for Transitional Justice.
For the U.S. China Academy of what?
For Transitional Justice. My next question will relate to this topic. First question, I want to know whether you are both including those four dimensions you mentioned: diplomatic relations, economic relations, popular culture, and then it goes deeper through education and cultural exchange.
So what are my...
Does the book include?
All
Do you
four.
cover all four?
Oh,
Yeah.
Or just
well,
the
I'm
last?
sorry.
Okay, I cover them mostly in the introduction. It's not because what I want to do is focus on the one that I think
The last one.
that I'm interested in, that I want to give a little more attention to. There are other books that, with not so much in depth on any one, but that cover them all. For example, David M. Lampton wrote a book on the earlier period, Same Bed, Different Dreams, that covers, I think, all those dimensions to some extent.
Yeah, my next question is, you mentioned the civil society, the concept, and then you think it's okay. So how to build up this model, this kind of civil society in China? How does Chinese Americans, a second generation, can be a bridge to contribute?
How can they?
I think there's need to increase their awareness. They don't know, maybe.
I think it's that kind of influence people outside of China, whether they're Chinese Americans or Euro Americans or African Americans, are going to have at best in a subtle and gradual way. For example, the students at the Hopkins-Nanjing Center who study with each other and learn about, they're Chinese students, they're learning about American society. One of the alumni of the Hopkins-Nanjing Center is a young man who's gone to work for, what's the center? Do you know the center where Yu Ka-ping is? It's kind of a party organization, but that has partnered with the Ford Foundation to have an award every year for over a period of 10 years.
That's actually, it's a branch of the party school.
Yeah.
But it's actually the Chinese Translators Union Association
that's what
that
it
gives
is.
out that award every year.
Yeah, but so they give this award in partnership with, with the Ford Foundation on innovations in governance. And so this is a young man who's in charge of that program, who views the program as being kind of at the cusp between government and civil society. And there's someone who studied I think at the Kennedy School and Harvard, and has, at least understands, the Western concept of civil society as being separate from the state. Similarly, that for a period of 8 or 9 years, the National Committee administered an exchange program that where Time Warner's different divisions would bring Chinese students from Fudan University to work for 3 months as interns in one division or another of the company, such as CNN News. And Jan collected, kind of debriefing memoirs of these young people after they had spent the 3 months in the United States. And they didn't, and before they started, they took kind of a tour of American institutions, both governmental and non-governmental. They go to places like the Stock Exchange, Congress, YMCA, and by the time these young people left, they had some understanding of how a society like ours works, and many of them would go back to careers such as news reporting in China. How that is going to affect Chinese society, again, I think gradually and incrementally.
Yes.
I'm Yuan Zhang. I'm a Columbia Law School student. Before I joined Columbia Law School, I have been public interest lawyer for the biggest public interest law organization in China for over 9 years. I have several questions, but I think you may have touched in your book because I have not read that, so I just asked. I hope you can share your key points here. I'm very interested in the topic. I think many of us will be very interested. My first question is, when you mentioned about modernization, what's the main factors or main goals about the modernization refer to, like justice or rule of law or democracy or urbanization, industrialization? So what do you refer to about modernization? The second question is, you mentioned there's an invited influence. What that means is the starting attitude, or is the ending attitude, or is the dynamic whole process is invited influence? My third question is about the role. You mentioned the role of American NGOs. So based on your case studies, what's your observation? Like, what's the strength of American NGOs in Chinese kind of modernization, and what's their weaknesses or what's their strengths? So what's your evaluation of their role? That's my three questions.
Let's see. So the last question is what were the strengths of American
Strengths and
NGOs?
weaknesses of
So kind of your
NGOs in China.
observation of their role.
So
your
these
evaluation.
three institutions you studied, which one is stronger? Which
No,
one?
that's not my question. My question is based on your observations, kind of your own evaluation for their role. So what are their strengths or what are their weaknesses?
Okay, are you talking about these three specific ones or American?
In general, but
In
based on your
general,
case
yeah.
studies, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, as I recall, I think your book chapter, you mentioned Tocqueville's associations, yeah, and this is something that foreign observers have, for almost 200 years have noticed about American society, that it tends to be a self-organized society. And the Frenchman Tocqueville in his book Democracy in America said that whereas in France or Britain you'd see the government or the aristocracy in charge of some project. In America you see the organization. And globally there's been an explosion, some people call it an NGO revolution over the last 30 years or so, but it's particularly in the United States. And so I think one of the strengths is that these organizations are independent of the government. Again, it gets complicated when they, if they take government funding, and it's something that I know that they have to be cautious about. What some critics of the role of the growing role internationally, globally, of NGOs have argued is that they're elitist organizations in the sense that they're not broadly elected or chosen, by the society at large. So it's a point to note, I think. But again, I think the great strength is that that they're voluntary and they're independent, autonomous from the state. I don't know if that answers your question.
Second part was inviting. Does the spirit of invitation, is it only at the beginning or at the
Yeah.
end or all the way through? And
Yeah, well, I think I think the spirit of invitation is consistent. And Jan was asking me about this during her podcast interview too, at least up till now. But I think the content has changed. I think that today, for example, Chinese think tanks no longer feel such a great need to have American economists help them understand a market economy. They understand it pretty well. On the other hand, they're in many ways, if the early challenge in the early reform period was modernization, and I know that was your first question, and I'll come back to that, and that'd be the easiest one for me to talk about. If the challenge in the early decade or two of reform was how to modernize the economy and everything else in society, in many ways the challenges now are how to deal with some of the effects of modernization, such as pollution, pornography, prostitution, drug abuse, a lot of the things that other modernizing societies have seen come with urbanization and those things. So at least until now, I think the spirit has been consistent, but the content has evolved. And in fact, if it gets to the point that the Chinese government doesn't want influences, they certainly have the power to close them off, which is a very different situation from say 100 years ago. Modernization, you mentioned several of the features, and not everyone agrees on what all constitutes modernization. I think you mentioned urbanization, industrialization. Yeah, there was a book edited by a guy named Seymour called The Fifth Modernization, named it after an essay at Democracy in 1978-79, essay on democracy wall by Wei Jingshun called The Fifth Modernization, because Zhou Enlai and Jinpings had promoted agriculture, industry, science and technology, the military, and Wei Jingshun, and democracy. A somewhat more neutral term that a lot of social theorists have used is mass political participation, but I think probably, in the long run, democracy is, it's hard to have all the other dimensions of a modern society without eventually coming to democracy. Korea and Chinese society that operates on island of Taiwan, whose exact status we don't have to settle here. Both modernized economically before they democratized. You mentioned rule of law. Again, it's somewhat, and I discuss this in my book, but it's a somewhat neutral term that has a certain set of common meanings in terms of predictability and equality before the law. Now, some people in China tend to use rule by law rather than rule of law, at least in the English language, rule of law. It has a connotation that that the state can't make arbitrary laws, as well as having regularity in the laws. But so modernization, yeah, it includes a lot of things, including urbanization. Typically involves smaller family size, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. Greater, more educated population.
I have three small questions. I'll
Introduce
ask you
yourself,
one.
please.
Oh, my name is Fang Zhang. I'm with Edelman. So the first question is, I've heard every local Chinese NGO, if you want to establish an NGO in China, of course they have to register, right? But I also learned that they have to be affiliate to a state-owned organization, and sometimes they even appoint a official to that organization, to that NGO, to affect even day-to-day operation. Is that true?
Mostly. Chapter 5 in my book actually gives kind of a survey of the situation. That affiliated organization to which they have to affiliate, they term that a mother-in-law. There was, a couple of years ago, there was an experiment in Guangdong with eliminating the mother-in-law requirement for some types of NGOs. For social service NGOs, and I believe business associations. And depending on how that works out and whether it turns out not to be a threat to social stability, it might expand. But additionally, there may be as many organizations operating unofficially as there are officially, with the full knowledge of the local authorities. And so they're not registered at all. One interesting example that I discuss in the book, there was a publication in both English and Chinese called the China Development Brief. It was started by a British man named Nick Young, whose wife had a job in China running
Save the children.
huh?
Save the children.
Yeah, Save the Children in
Couldn't.
Kunming. Thank you. So she's got all the copy editors and remembering the facts for me. Omnicompetent. But the Chinese language, and the content was overlapped, but it was a little bit different. The English language version was a little more of social theory and analysis and things like we're talking about here. What is civil society? Does China have one? Using specific examples, whereas the Chinese language version was more about the mechanics of how to run an NGO and which ones were successful and what you had to do to not get in trouble with the government. So the Chinese version was registered with the government. The English version was not registered with the government, but eventually set up in, moved from Kunming to Beijing. And I visited their office once. I had to interview some people. I had to go through the hutongs, and it was quite a complicated trip. And they said, well, that's how we test how interested people are if they can find us. Anyway, but the English language version never did register. And then 6 or 7 years ago, one day the local government closed down the English version, kicked Nick Young out of the country, and no one ever, that I've seen, ever understood exactly what happened. But most unofficial organizations just continue to operate as long as they.
Illegally.
Yeah, it's technically it's illegally, but well, I think they call it one eye open, one eye closed.
Yeah. The second question is, for the foreign NGOs, when they enter China, do they are they enduring more strict regulation from the government or not?
There have been several sets of regulations starting in it was 1991, a couple years after. There really weren't formal regulations at the time of Tiananmen Square. The government kind of observed what was happening and wasn't sure how to respond, and then in the wake of Tiananmen Square, they said, well, we should have some semblance of organizations, but we should have some control over it. There was a big push forward toward more NGOs. Interestingly, after 1995, there was an international women's conference in Beijing, and wherever that conference meets, they have an affiliated meeting of NGOs. And on the one hand, the Chinese government said, well, what's an NGO? And they started doing research on this thing. Well, that's modern societies have those, we should have them. But on the other hand, they knew that all these foreign NGOs and possible troublemakers were coming, so they set it up, depending on who was right, either 25 or 50 kilometers.
Depends on where you're starting from.
Yeah, well, I just noticed when I was rereading the book for the first time, one place Elizabeth Nubb said it was 25 kilometers, another place, some other woman said it was 50. Anyway, they set the NGO forum outside the city, but they still were able, there were still a number of the Chinese who were able to interact. Okay, but is it getting stricter and more strict? I think in 97 and then again in about 2003, there have been successive regulations, but my sense is they haven't restricted the scope of activity, they've just formalized it. So I'm not sure I've detected a trend toward either liberalizing or restricting, just kind of making it more formal. One of the most recent changes set up rules for funding, funding organizations like the Ford Foundation, which are different from NGO member organizations.
The last question would be for the local NGOs and foreign NGOs. It's going to be a really broad question. What can they do to improve to be more effective with this tightly controlled situation?
It depends who you ask, but you asked me. If you asked an organization called Human Rights in China, which is based here in New York, is anybody familiar with it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they're, I don't know if I'd go so far as to call them confrontational, although they have been acted confrontationally in some cases, but they've tried, their answer, I think, would be to keep the pressure on China through publicity, mainly through publicity. But if you ask organizations like the three that I write about, mainly in my book, I think the answer would, and I would endorse it, would be to have more exchanges. But to know what your non-negotiable principles are, such as Stephen Muller, who said we badly want to have an educational exchange, but we won't compromise on academic freedom. There was an event just a few, 3 or 4 years ago at Hopkins-Nanjing that kind of, highlights this, the nuance one has to practice. A student published some kind of a booklet that was critical of some government policies, and the joint governing body of the Hopkins-Nanjing Center, which was Chinese and American, refused to fund that for distribution in the city of Nanjing or beyond. So on the one hand, there was a limit there, but on the other hand, it freely circulated on campus and was even in the placed in the library for students or outsiders who came in and used the library to read. And I think every organization, whether a business or an NGO or the United States government that interacts with China or any other country has to weigh, well, what compromises do we have to make in order to have some kind of exchange, and which ones are we willing to make? But I would endorse an answer, have more exchanges, but know what your principles are.
We have time for one, I know, but how many other questions were there? I know we have one here.
I'll be
But
short-winded.
I do want to just add a coda to that last question that you asked. Because one of the things that comes out in the book, and that I know because at the National Committee we know a lot of players in this, but this principle that Stephen Muller and others who were the initiators of the Nanjing Hopkins program, their absolute fierce determination to make sure that academic freedom was practiced, not all over China, but on their campus, and not necessarily all over the Nanjing University campus, but within the walls of the center. They stuck to this very fiercely, and this has become a touchstone for all of the universities from outside China that are now moving into China, whether it's NYU Shanghai or whether it's the Duke Kunshan relationship. They see that strong stand that the Hopkins part of the Nanjing Hopkins program took, and they have that as their own bar under which they will not go. And having the Nanjing Hopkins adhere to this through crises such as the Belgrade bombing or the Tiananmen incident has made it much easier for foreign institutions who are now coming into China, who very much believe in academic freedom, to establish that as the minimum that they will adhere to. So when you ask about the influence of some of these organizations and what they did, I would point to that as one of the strongest and one of the most long-lasting and important
elements for the civil society that China should be.
And that story that Jan just told very well is in chapter 4.
My question is about
Introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, I'm Andrew Hubert, now of Holt University, but before I was in NYU in Shanghai. My question is about the future. A lot of your examples, and they're great examples, but they're from like the 1990s and the 1980s when China was struggling to modernize. China's pretty modern now. What's the future role of NGOs? Is the impact how's the impact going to change, especially in terms of education?
I don't know.
Okay.
The nice thing about being a historian is you can speculate if you want to, but it will be different. It will be different. But I'm hesitant to speculate.
Does your
Okay,
book have
thank you.
answer for this?
Any last questions? If not, there is, yes, sorry.
I'm Mary Ellen Morrison, Assistant of International Education. And you may not know the answer to this, but we are in the process, we have a Beijing office, and we're in the process of changing our registration from a registered office to a wholly owned foreign entity because our partner organization changed its mind and decided not to partner with us anymore. So I just want to know if you're familiar with NGOs as wholly owned foreign entities, and if you find that to be beneficial or detrimental as an NGO operating in China under that registration status? Do you have any insight into that?
Well, my impression was that there isn't one answer, that it seemed to me that some found it, that they had more flexibility if they could just operate on their own, whereas others felt that they benefited from the entrees that, the guanxi that having a partner would have. I know that in the business world there was a similar, trade-off. Company I, previously worked for, talked with, actually did both. At one point, had a joint venture to manufacture vehicles with another company, but also my mission was to just set up a factory that would be wholly owned. And so it's a trade-off, and I don't think there's one correct answer. But someone that you might, I forgot to mention when we were talking about China development brief, there's someone who has a fairly close connection with the National Committee, right? Sean Xia, who, if you don't know him, I think Jan could help you contact him. Might be a good person to ask if you're looking for consulting on which way to go. And if he doesn't know, I'll bet he could put you in touch with someone who could help.
Ira, do you have an answer to that?
I don't have an answer. Raises the question for me, why your partner, after all these years, decided not to partner with you. Yeah, which I think is a question I wanted to ask if we had more time. I know you don't want to predict the future, but just based on what's happening in the present, the environment for foreign NGOs in China seems to be getting more difficult.
Funding is restricted funding coming from overseas for NGOs.
And so, without asking you to predict the future, maybe just based on your reviewing the past and telling a story that I really appreciate you telling, China doesn't seem to acknowledge in a very public way the contributions of foreign NGOs in China's modernization or development, and in fact now seems to be making it much more difficult for the kinds of exchanges you were talking about, as well as other activities. So what's your assessment of the situation for foreign NGOs in China today?
Yeah. I haven't really, it's been several years, probably about 3 years since I did the research, so it's possible that I know just from reading the newspaper that the environment's gotten a lot more difficult in Russia for foreign NGOs, and they've passed specific legislation, adding restrictions and kicking NGOs out. I haven't read those kinds of articles about China. Maybe things are going on that are, causing some restriction. The sense I had as of a couple of, 2.5, 3 years ago, was that there were different tendencies in China. There certainly was a tendency by, a large, if not dominant faction in party of the government to place, definite limits. But on the other hand, there were maybe a smaller faction in the party and government that were encouraging, and there would periodically be editorials and articles in China Daily saying we don't have enough NGOs, and praise for work at the time of the Sichuan earthquake, things like that, again, of environmental NGOs. But I think I tend to be an optimist, and I think in the long run, it's really going to be difficult for the party and the government to keep a lid on a society that wants to be more self-organized as young people continue their education, including study abroad. Social media have played a significant role in creating horizontal linkages in society. So I tend to think, short of really harsh repression that I just don't foresee, that it'd be difficult for the government to reverse the role of either domestic or foreign NGOs. But we'll see.
Okay, everybody join me. Thank you very much.